Thank you all for coming this evening. What I'm going to talk about is a certain type of flooding which arises from what I call prolonged rainfall events. Now, these are the events which have caused the major flooding in the last few years in this area and other parts of the country. This is as distinct from short, sharp, intense storms where you get flash flooding, which is a completely different problem. The three events that I'm going to consider first of all to see what we've learned from them before we can do anything are the events of the 21st of January 2008, the 24th and 25th of September 2012, and of course this last Christmas. Now, the first thing that I want to mention is that we've, in the last couple of weeks, Bradford Council have released a document called Local Flood Risk Management Strategy. Right? This follows on from a long report which was published 2 years ago, and I believe this follow-up was triggered by the December events. Let me just say, with regard to this document, the first two flooding events, which I deem to be significant in the Bradford area, 21st of January 2008 and the 24th and 25th of September 2012, are not even mentioned in this document. And furthermore, anything that's to be learnt from Christmas is still to be awaited. One thing I want to take from this document, I just want to read something to you, which is deemed as one of the major ways forward. And what it says, and I quote word for word, investigations will utilise local flood risk information and, where appropriate, employing computer modelling analysis to accurately assess flooding mechanisms within each of these areas to arrive at cost-effective flood management solutions. Right? The key point being there, employing computer modelling analysis to accurately assess flooding mechanisms. So that's the way forward as seen here. Secondly, I'd like to mention a report which was published 18 months ago by Dr. Duncan Reid. It was an independent report for Bradford Council. It had to be done in a short time frame, basically 3 weeks, so it was very much a qualitative judgment of what's happened in the past and what is happening, rather than a quantitative assessment of exactly what was happening. Those two reports, plus the others that I'm going to reference during this talk, are available through Phil here on the website, and there'll be electronic downlinks to them, right, which could be explained later. Yeah, all right, yeah. Fine, thank you. All right, so let's get back to this first event, the 21st of January 2008. Now, this prolonged rainfall event, as I described it, was 45 millimetres of rain in 24 hours. Okay? The September 2012 was somewhat more, 82 millimetres, but it lasted 54 hours. Okay? And the Christmas one was 54 millimetres, and that lasted 24 hours. So those are the sort of storms we're talking about. To put that into context, the December the 5th event in Cumbria, for 24 hours, they had 340 millimetres of rain, with another 60 following in the next 14 hours. If we'd have been unfortunate and had that weather system come over here, then you can imagine what devastation it would have caused. Right? But that puts in perspective. Might I say, these are the types of storms that cause the flooding in recent times. There was one real short, sharp storm some time ago, namely the 12th of July 1900, where 100 millimetres fell in a few hours over Ilkley Moor. Now, some of you are aware the devastation in Ilkley was immense. all the roads were torn up, the culverts like in Brook Street ripped at the street, houses were came down, and there was loss of life. Now that sort of storm is very difficult to do anything about, let me say. That's classical so-called 1 in 100 year storm. But these other prolonged ones that we're talking about are much more frequent, every 3 or 4 years, and in fact sort of slightly smaller ones occur several times a year. And in fact we had 5 last year alone of similar or slightly less intensity. Anyway, the other important thing about this one on January the 21st 2008, in the previous 2 weeks from the 7th to the 21st of January, there was a total of 145 millimetres of rain. That means the first 13 days there was 100 millimetres and then 45 on the last day. That was the wettest ever recorded 2-week period in the history of Bradford recording weather information. So what you have is a period beforehand where you have persistent rain, and then you have something a bit more than that slightly after. And the same characteristic was true of September 2012 and of Christmas 2015. That's the situation we're trying to look at here. Right, we had some, and the other thing I wanted to mention that's significant in recent times is the invention of the smartphone. And people have the ability to have it with them and take photographs when something happens, and in particular take video clips. And you can send it around the world in a matter of seconds. Now, the information which can be obtained from those is immense. And you're probably aware for the Christmas period, the amount that was on social media was enormous. A lot from around this area, and everywhere else that got the flooding. So it's very important to recognise that's been a significant change in the knowledge base that we have for flooding. So let's go to the first slide, which is a photograph that was taken on January 21st, 2008. And I first saw this a couple of years after it was there, after it was taken. And what's happened here? Right. This is just at the back there at Derry Hill, and we have a water course where that line of trees is across there, but this is all water coming down from the field, going across the public footpath into an 11,000 volt electric substation. Right? Now, you think, what can I determine from that? I'm an engineer, and I can look at that and think, there are issues, there's turbulent water, etc. I can have a rough feel for what the rate of flow of water is through that electric substation. I approached certain professionals in the activity about how do I get that information from that photograph, and the response was simply, you didn't have a flow meter fitted, and you didn't have a measurement of depth of water fitted, so you can't get it. Right? Well, I'm not normally put off by such things. So, look very carefully. I don't know whether you can see, there's a water level there. In fact, on the digital photograph here, you can blow it really up in that region. You've got certain corrosion marks on that, going down that actual post there. You can just about see them on this slide here. Well, I can, probably you can't. But they're distinct corrosion marks. Right? So I thought, how do you get, first of all, the depth of water?
Thank you.
Right, I can't see anybody's face now. So how do you get the depth of water from that? Well, it's very simple. You get a competent photographer, such as Graham here, to go out and in a dry condition, take the identical photograph. Okay? So this is the same photograph with dry conditions. Okay? And there you can see now the corrosion marks. So I can take the previous photograph, take that part that I had where the water was flowing here and superimpose it on there, and I can measure the depth of the water pretty accurately by knowing where the base is and how tall the posts are. And it was the depth was 24 centimetres within plus or minus a centimetre. So I got that pretty well just by doing that. Now that's only half the problem. The next half is how fast was the water flowing. Now, can I just have the light back on the second plate? Thank you. The bottom of this electric substation is a flat concrete slab going right across. The equipment, most of it, is raised 30 centimetres or more above that slab, including this 11,000 volt transformer. Now, so you've got a flat slab and it actually falls away quite a bit at the back. So this is not water that was ponding, it's flowing. Okay? So if you think about it, you've got a flat piece of concrete, water's flowing over it, we don't know how fast it's going, but if it was going at a certain speed, you'd know it'd shoot off the end as sort of a jet and land some way distance away. You know that. If it was going a bit slower, it'd go along and drop down sooner, okay, because it's not going as fast. If it's going slower still, then it reaches a point where it just drops off the end of the slab. And that's a slower speed than the others. Right? Now, if it was trying to go any slower than that, you can prove by energy considerations it would have to be shallower, the water. So for a given depth of water, assuming that it was just dropping off the end, you can get a minimum speed for the water, direct from a very simple formula. Okay? So you can get a minimum number. And the minimum number was 1.5 meters per second, which is quite fast. Right? So for that depth of water, it had to be flowing at least 1.5 meters per second. So we've got two things, the depth, the speed. All we need now is the width. Now the width of that entrance was 9 meters, but there were some obstacles. And you could see one at the right hand side there. So the effective width was about 5 to 6 meters. Let's just say it's 5 meters. So doing that calculation, very simple one, you find that the flow of water through there was at least, now stress, at least 1,500 litres per second. Where does that get us? Well, the problem is, to take this water away from that area and the whole of the fields nearby, there's one watercourse which is culverted under Dickgarth Road there. That watercourse has a capacity of 400 litres per second. So this is at least 1,500 and a lot more trying to go into a hole that can only take 400 litres per second. It doesn't work. And what happens, all that excess water, 1,000 litres or more, can't get in there. It flows in the gardens of Moorfield Avenue, down the back of Dickgarth Road. It gets into the combined sewers. It goes in the combined sewers, blows the manhole cover off in Main Street, puts sewage all over the street. It actually blows it off further down on Fairfax Road as well. It just doesn't have the capacity, the system, to take what I've just shown. So, how do we solve this problem? Well, you think, right, what we need to do is make a much, much bigger culvert to take all that water away and take it down through the village. Not quite as easy as you think that, and it's a very expensive thing to do, particularly about the land you'd have to go through to put that particular culvert in place. Furthermore, it's a very undesirable thing to do because you're taking that water and making it go even quicker down to the river, so you're passing on extra flooding to other people further downstream. Not very desirable at all. So it's expensive, not very desirable, and therefore it's not a real solution. If you add this all over the places where this is happening, you just increase the flow in the river and you get more flooding in Otley, Linton Bridge and Tadcaster. Simple. So it's not a solution. So we need to move on now to see how we can address it slightly differently. And the way we address it slightly differently is to say, Well, if we can't let that water flow like that, we've got to somehow or other stop it getting there. Right? That's the alternative. So let's move on to the September 2012, September the 24th and 25th event. Now, this is that Derry Hill site a bit further up, and where I showed you that water course, this is the water course halfway up. Now, what is known about this, and it's from simple calculations of knowing what the water course is, that the capacity of that water course before it overflows is about 1,300 litres per second. Okay? That's what we do now. So, this water course has a capacity of about 1,300 litres per second. So let me run this video. Now we've got videos, right? Video clips. So let me just run this one. Right? And you can see, we're looking at that one, you can see how fast it's flowing. Right? And it goes down. Right? Can we pan away from it now? Okay. We're going back across the field there. And you can see it flooding right over the field, coming out of there, flooding down. Now then, let's go to the next one, goes from the bottom looking up. Okay, that's the continuation of the water course, but a lot of it's come out before it's got to that point. And you got an impression of the speed of it there. And then we pan round and you see that it's gone right across the field, and the electrical substation is there. Okay? So we were looking there before from that point. So you can see what was happening on that. So what we can say from that is that the flow in that water course at that time was at least 1,300 litres per second. Right? That's what it tells us, right? Completely. So, how do we, what do we do to go from there? Because if we're looking at trying to store water, then we have to know what the total volume was, not just the rate at which it's flowing. To get the water away from the site, you need to know the rate of flow. To do something about storing it above, you need to know how much water's involved. Okay? So, how do we do that? Now then, you remember that I quoted from this first document about the way forward is the computer modelling, etc. Okay? Now then, 3 years ago, the Environment Agency sent a letter to Bradford Council regarding this site, which said, "We have seen various details and photographs for the September 2012 rainfall event submitted by Menston Action Group. The information contains detailed date and time information. We recommend that the lead local flood authority, which is Bradford Council, forwards this information to the consultants working on behalf of the developer. Together with any rainfall data that we can provide, the consultant should be able to simulate the September 2012 rainfall event on the proposed development site to give an indication of how the infrastructure would cope. Given that we are party to this storm information prior to construction, we think that it would be prudent to ensure that there are no design changes required to the surface water drainage scheme." So that was 3 years ago. It was totally ignored, so you wonder what is the role of a statutory consultee in these sort of proceedings. So 2 years ago we decided to do that ourselves. Right? We employed JBA Consulting, who are a senior company in this area who know what they're doing, and we asked them to simulate the September 2012 event for this site and work out what the volume of water was. Right? This is what we're supposed to do. Okay? Now then, the starting point there is to get what's called a LiDAR three-dimensional map. This is a digital map of the whole area with 3D. It's very fine. It does all the contours very, very accurately, going over the whole area. And we deliberately took it to go right up on the moor, so we didn't miss any drop of rain that might fall on the ground and get into this watercourse. Right? We were ensured we did that. We got the rainfall data from the Environment Agency. Of course, we had to pay for it, whereas the developer would get it free. And then all that was put into a very sophisticated commercial piece of software called Tuflow. And this is a finite element type processor that takes the rainfall event, the curvature, and takes the equations for the flow of water and works out everywhere in this catchment area what the depth of water is and what the rate of flow is. It does both. So you can get the rate of flow and the depth anywhere in the whole area. Okay? And of course, we were particularly interested in this watercourse because that's where we got the video, that's where we know what the water was flowing. So on this supercomputer, it took exactly 2 weeks to run this to get an answer. So I'm going to put up what the answer was in the next chart. Now don't get put off for a moment, right? But this was the result of 2 weeks solid computing on a supercomputer. Okay? Now then, let me explain what it is. The red ones at the top coming down, well, these are hours at the bottom going across. Right? And basically the storm lasted 54 hours. Right? These red lines coming down, each one represents the amount of rain that fell in every quarter of an hour over the 54 hours. Right? So there's 216 of them. Okay? Now, so that means the information is quantized time-wise. That's called a sample data type system. Okay? So what we've got for the rainfall is in digital form, and we just get the amount that fell every single quarter of an hour. Right? That's what it comes in. Furthermore, you look carefully, you see the amount of rain gets bigger as we go down. That's the way it's plotted. That one is the largest, that quarter of an hour period, which was 1.6 millimetres. Not very much. That was the maximum in any quarter of an hour period. You'll also notice that the next one, next to it was 1.4, there's a 1.2 there, a 1. So they're actually quantized again in value to the nearest 0.2 of a millimetre. Right? So the whole thing's in digital format, right, that you get it from the Environment Agency. So it's timed, what's called the sample data, and the values are quantized as well. So that's what's put in to this digital LiDAR map, and you've got this digital processor called Tuflow that computes the flow. And the flow that was computed, it gradually came out the answer, is this blue curve which shows the flow in that watercourse as time progresses. The reason that is really sample data, but flow in this sort of watercourse is not as erratic as any means as the rainfall event. It's quite smooth. You can think about it. It doesn't change dramatically. It goes slowly, goes up and down the rate of flow. And so it's actually done as a continuous thing. Right? So that's the flow. The volume of water involved is the area under this blue curve. You know, you add it all up as you go along the whole rainfall event, and that gives you total amount of water. Great. There's one problem. You look here, the peak flow. Okay, you can see it there. You go across and read it. 130 litres a second. So we've done this computer analysis very accurately to get the right answer. It's given an answer 130 litres a second. Not the 1300 we've recorded on the video. The computer was okay. That's what the answer is, right, from there. So if we follow the Environment Agency's recommendations, do this, we get an answer of 130 litres a second, no problem, that could flow away through the culvert. Let's ignore what really did happen, because that's not the advice given to us by the Environment Agency. That's what any council could say, or any developer. But the videos say something different, totally different. 10 times as much water. So the volume is not right. So you think, wait a minute, the rainfall data is accurate, we know that, right? Our video is accurate. So from that, can we in any way get at this volume that was there? And the answer is yes, because this sort of problem exists in other walks of life. Having spoken to experts in drainage and that about this problem, the answer was always, you need to have a flow meter there for 54 hours, you can't get the answer, right? But that is not true. And in fact, in certain areas of electronics, this sort of a problem arises. And in fact, one of the most obvious areas is in mobile phones. Right? And basically, the way it's developed over the last 25 years is basically the information sent to your mobile phone from a base station and vice versa is done as a very short pulse, short period of time, which is typically less than 1,000th of a second. And the key, when you do that, is to identify what remains invariant, unchanged, during that 1,000th of a second. And if you know something about the answer you're trying to find out, can you get the rest? And the answer is yes, and that's exactly what your smartphone does and what the system does. So what does it mean in terms of this? Well, what it means is that if we've got the rainfall event, well, no, and we do, that's all recorded. If we know something about the peak value around here, and we do from the video, can we get the volume here over the whole period of time? The period of time is the rainfall event. So we need to look at what remains unchanged or invariant over the period of the rainfall event itself. Okay? Now then, rain, as you well know, comes from the sky down to the ground. Okay? It could actually evaporate and go back up. But in the time frame we're talking about of this rainfall event, the amount that could possibly evaporate and go back up is negligible. Right? So rain in every period is non-negative. It comes down. All these lines come down to give a positive recording. You don't get one of them going back the other way saying the water's gone back up as rain up into the sky. Pretty obvious, right? But it means a lot mathematically. Right? Okay? It means a lot. So we've got our first condition, that rainfall is a monotonic increasing function over the rainfall event. What's the second condition we want? Well, we did actually have two rainfall measurements for this rainfall event from the Environment Agency. One for the Silsden Reservoir, which was the nearest one in the west, and one in the east at Otley Sewage Works. Now you know how far apart they are, right? They were very, very similar. The only real difference between them was that the Otley one was delayed from the Silsden one by about a quarter of an hour. That was the speed at which the weather front was coming over the area. Okay? Now then, what's assumed then is that at any quarter of an hour period, you're getting the same rain everywhere in the catchment period. That's what the computer program assumes. Yeah, because you've got that because the whole thing would come right over. Now, the water in the watercourse. Well, obviously, there's going to be some component of that due directly to the rain falling locally to that watercourse. Obviously, right? If it's a bit more intense near the watercourse, there's going to be a bit more in the watercourse, right? But there's something else. Rain falling further away has to travel on the surface to get to this watercourse. Now, rain travelling on the surface flows a lot slower than the speed of the weather system going across. A lot slower. Right? The weather system is much faster going over than the flow of the water. So you'll have another contribution to that flow in the watercourse, which is delay. Is the rainfall that fell some distance away and took a quarter of an hour to get to that watercourse point. So it's just a delayed version of the rainfall event, proportional to it. Some may have been further away still, half an hour away, and therefore it would be delayed half an hour delay on the equivalent weather system, so rainfall event, sorry. So you've got two conditions. Simple. What can you do with that? Well, mathematically, you can do a lot with it. And in fact, you can get a conditional relationship, similar to what we had for the flow of water in the electric substation. You can work out the minimum velocity of water. In this case, you can work out the minimum volume of water involved, knowing only the rainfall event and something about the peak value, or close to the peak value, what was happening. And that is absolutely correct. Right? There's no question about it. And the way we proved it was correct, proves a strong word here, we gave examples of why it's correct. For this catchment, in addition to that September 2012 event, we actually ran 4 other storm events, which were the so-called classical 1 in 100 year, 1 hour, 2 hour, 3 hour and 6 hour rainfall events for the same catchment. We ran it all and we looked at this condition that developed against those at different time intervals, etc., and showed it worked perfectly everywhere and gave an underestimate, but it wasn't too far below the actual true value that you computed according to just pure surface water capture. Then we applied it to this big one, the September 2012 one, right? And of course, the input here, this rainfall event, is pretty erratic, right? But it was applied and it worked again, exactly right. And in fact, the most interesting thing about it was that if we knew something about the peak flow here over a 3-hour period, and we did know that because it had been observed over that period of time, then we can get the total volume over 54 hours to within 3% of the answer. So it's a very simple formula. So what we've got is a video clip, we've got the weather system, and we've got a simple formula that gets us the total volume within 3%, knowing a little bit about it. And it's right, I can assure you, it's right, that. Now, what does that mean? Well, we had 10 times as much water, the rate of flow in that watercourse than the 1300. Right? So if you take what we did have, use this formula, you find the minimum volume of water which flowed in that watercourse during that rainfall event was 100,000 cubic meters of water. Okay? Now, think about storing that. It needs a reservoir 100 meters by 100 meters by 10 meters deep. Okay? Now, that's a pretty expensive thing to do. But more to the point, it's extremely dangerous to build something like that above a place like Menston. Because if anything happened to it, you've got 100,000 tons of water suddenly coming down onto you, which would destroy property, take lives, etc. It's a non-starter. So where have we gotten to now? We can't put in a larger water course, that doesn't work. Looking at storing water above it is just not practical or cost effective. So how do we find a solution to the flooding problem? Now, let me just say that 10 times as much water we're getting than we've measured. Where did that water come from? We know how much there was now, but where did it come from? We know everything that fell from the sky that could have got there directly, we've captured. But we've got 10 times as much water, so where's it come from? There can only be one place it has actually come from, and that is out of the ground in that surface water capture area. There's nowhere else. If it was trying to flow over from somewhere, we'd have got it, captured it. Right? By the computer software went right up on the moor, right? And went to place where any rain was going exactly the opposite direction. Okay? So it's got to be coming out of the ground. This calculation that I just did, it didn't make any difference. It's valid in any event. It just takes a lot longer to flow in the ground. And in fact, one thing I didn't mention on this curve was that in the real world, when it was measured this, you can see, so that's the computerized one, that was the peak rain there. The peak flow was an hour later, just over an hour later, which you'd expect. What happened in the real world, that peak flow was 6 hours later. So it meant the time it took for water to get down there was a lot longer, and that means it was travelling in the ground because it travels much more slowly inside the ground. So let's just go on to a few photographs now. Now this was taken the same time as that video, above the Derry Hill site going up towards the moor. Now this is normally just a nice green field. Okay? What you see here is water coming through that dry stone wall up there from above there and flowing down like a river down here. That's normally a nice green field. There's no way that that water there could have got here in that volume from any direct surface capture above it. Let's go on to the next one, which is a bit further down the slope. You've got to remember, this is on quite a slope. Right? This is not land with ponding water. It's on a big slope. Okay? So you've got water coming out of the ground and flowing. You can see it. Right? Not ponding, because you've got a big slope. It's flowing. Let's go on to the next one, a bit further down still. You can see different areas of where it's coming out of the ground. Again, more evidence of it coming out of the ground. So that's what we had. That's what we've got. How do we tackle now? Sorry. How do we tackle the problem? Well, this leads us now to December this last year. Okay, our last lot of information we talked about this last Christmas. Okay, now let's just go on to the start of the next slide. Now, this is the same area, this Derry Hill area. Okay, I'm just going to show you a video in a moment. But before I put it on, I want to explain. This was December this last year. It was more than 4 years ago that the original planning permission was given to build houses on this site. Okay? So, if it had gone ahead, what would have been there at Christmas this last year? Let me tell you. The first thing, where I photograph here, to the left of here, which is off the photograph, there would have been a large thing called a detention basin. And this would have been dug into the ground, capable of storing more than 1,000 cubic metres of water. The reason that that's there is because the Environment Agency guidelines for developers is that you take a 1 in 100 year 6-hour storm, you take just the rain falling on the site, you calculate how much increase the runoff will be due to the fact there are roads and roofs on the site. Right? So you calculate how much more. You take away what would have run off the site without it being there. You've got to store the difference and release it at the rate that it would have been if the development hadn't have existed. You understand that one? Right? So that's why it's there. So it's a detention basin that stores water, and it has in it a thing called a hydro brake, which controls the rate of runoff from it, and it's got to go somewhere, that water, and it would have been connected to this culverted watercourse in Dickgarth Road, which we know is totally overwhelmed and in a surcharge mode. Such culverts can't accept water. In fact, they do the opposite, where you try and connect water to them from a smaller source. It's a bit like the River Foss trying to flow into the River Ouse in York. When they're in full flood, all that happens is water from the River Ouse goes up the River Floss and floods it all. That's why the Foss barrier was built. But it's the same issue here. You get it coming back. So in fact, this detention basin would have been full of water anyway. It's not a 1 in 100 year storm, this is now, right? It would be not emptying, it would overflow, and it would flood all the houses in Walker Road. So you would have been flooded this Christmas if this development had gone ahead. Now then, the other thing, we're going to look up here where it's all coming out of the watercourse. Well, what was going to happen was all the way down this watercourse, down to here, there's going to be a metre high bank built to stop the water coming out. Alright? So if it stops the water coming out, that means more continues down. So let's run this first video. Okay. This was Graham again.
I've had a drink. It's boxing day.
Look very closely as we get close. Look at the speed of the water coming down there. Can you see? It's all coming out, that water. We go down the watercourse. This is the next point where it comes out. Stops there. Now then, the next video is going to go on from here. But let me just say, where this has just stopped this video, that point, then what was going to be there was a large pipe, 1.2 metres in diameter, 12 metres long, to stop the water coming out of that part, such that a road could be built over it. So not only have we stopped it coming out further up, we're stopping it coming out there as well. So that means all the water that's going to be coming out of here, or coming out before, is now focused out of this big pipe. All that is focused straight into Moorfield Avenue. So all that extra water would have been pouring into Moorfield Avenue and flooding the gardens and if probably the houses as well. So let's carry on and see what happens now. Okay, now then you can see it where it's coming out down here and coming down. Oh, look at it coming through the dry stone wall. They're not very good, those dry stone walls. Now then, you can see how fast the water's going down that side of the electric substation. So our original estimate of speed that we got from the January 2008 wasn't far wrong. You can see it flowing into the gardens down there. Okay? So, that's what we had. Right? It just emphasises the information we had in 2008, that we had in 2012 was absolutely correct. This is the third time we've had it. Right? This is the periodicity of this sort of event, every 4 years or so. That, if you go back, that's what it has been. And in fact, every 20 years, there's something worse. Like 2000, 1982, 1963, 1947, if you go back in time. Okay? Now then, let's just look at some more different pictures here about the groundwater emergence. Now, if we move on to the next slide. This was taken by a well-known Leeds academic that lives in Manston. Right? And this is a picture much further round going from Bleach Mill down towards the end of Clarence Drive. Right? This is a nice green field. Unfortunately, it's got a river running down it. That was a Boxing Day afternoon. Okay? Let's move on to the next one, which is... Now then, this is the Bingley Road, from Bingley Road, between Bingley Road and Huxford Lane, where the second large development was to go ahead with Taylor Wimpey building development. Again, it had outline planning permission more than 4 years ago, so it could have gone ahead and been well developed by now. It could have been. Now, as it happens, this was Boxing Day, but it was similar in September 2012. And we had JBA do the same computer analysis that they did for the other site, for this site, right? The whole of the September 2012 event. A point of reference to find out where the flow was is actually off this photograph to the right. And it's actually a culvert in the adjacent field that takes the water out to Red House Gardens. The culvert has a capacity of 110 litres per second. That's not in dispute. Okay? So the computer program worked out what the peak flow was for that whole of the September event, 2012 event, flowing into that watercourse. The answer was the peak value was 13 litres per second, not very much. Okay? It was, in these events, it was observed that the watercourse was flowing actually about 3/4 full. That meant about 80 litres a second. So in that case, there was a difference of 6-1 from the direct surface water capture to what was actually flowing. So there's 5 times as much water coming out of the ground. The problem in this case is it's coming out of the ground on the site itself. What you're seeing on this side, from top, which is here, to bottom, there's a 10-metre drop. You know, it's not flat, it's a 10-metre drop. So over here, you've got water coming out of the ground, flowing down, and you've got it coming out of the ground in different places. This is on the site itself. Right, so what would have happened then if the development had gone ahead? Well, let me just say, this last year, this happened 5 times. 15th of January, 9th of May, 15th of November, 12th of December, and 26th of December. Okay? Well-known dates. So, if the houses had been built, what would happen? Well, if they were built where the groundwater was coming out, it had just come up under the houses onto the floorboards of the houses. Right? And it's interesting what it would do then. Furthermore, putting the foundations of the houses into the ground brings up more groundwater. It causes more to flow. Okay? And then thirdly, on this site, not only did you have a large detention basin to be down here, okay, which would have done the same thing as it did on Derry Hill. It would have filled up with water, with groundwater immediately, and overflowed. You had pipes put in the ground as well, going right across the floor of the groundwater, large pipes to store more water. So in the first instance you have a buoyancy issue, the pipe, but in the second instance the pipes bring the groundwater up to the surface themselves and create even more groundwater flow. How do we know this would happen? Well, as it happens, there's another site in Bradford that was given planning permission at the same time as this one, but it has gone ahead and the houses have been built. It flooded 5 times last year. And what happened was the water coming up through the houses, there was sufficient water to blow holes in the mortar between the stones on the house and create jets of water coming out of the houses. Okay? The detention basin, there were 2 of them, were full for these rainfall events, totally full, overflowing, creating more flooding on the streets and in the gardens, and it came, obviously, the foundations of the houses brought more to the surface. That's what would have happened. In fact, they were so desperate on one of the occasions, this hydrobrake that controls the flow from the detention basin was released, and it caused havoc downstream and for the houses, the older houses below the site. So that's what happens if you go ahead with standard information or guidelines from the Environment Agency to develop a site. Just really consider rain falling on the site. We've no doubt there's a lot more water than you think there is. The two solutions, which are to increase the flow down to the river, is not really practical, not desirable, expensive. Trying to store the amounts of water that are involved, again, is not practical. It's very expensive and dangerous. So how do we solve the problem? Okay. Well, as it happens, round here at Menston, we had for 100 years an experiment going on, which worked. And the experiment started in the middle 1880s. And it was decided to build a large hospital in this area on Low Moor. Low Moor now is High Roads, okay? And the Victorian engineers, who were pretty good, said, you're going to build it there because you'll have a plentiful supply of water, and that's what we need. Now, it wasn't obvious to me, or it wouldn't have been obvious to me at the time, but the way they were getting the water, they were putting a pump into the ground to take the groundwater out, which went down 23 metres, in fact, just to the south of High Roads Hall, for the people who know it. Okay? They decided they could get sufficient water out of that to supply the whole of the hospital. And to make it work, they pumped the water out of there and pumped it up to a new reservoir that they built. This was what's known as a below ground covered reservoir. If you look in it today, it's remarkable. It looks like the inside of a very large church with arches and everything. Fantastic piece of engineering. So that's what happened. The water was pumped out, pumped up to the reservoir, and the reservoir fed all the water down to High Roads Hospital. Okay? Now, let me just give you some figures from the license that was obtained on water extraction there. And I'm going back to the old numbers here. They're allowed to extract 6,000 gallons per hour, 100,000 gallons per day, 30 million gallons of water per year. And the reservoir was sufficient to store water for 3 months' supply. That's how they designed it. That's how it was built. There was only one point in time where the Nailey ran out, which was in 1949 when there was a severe drought. Otherwise, they had the complete supply of water to the hospital at all times. Now, what's happened since, or shortly after that, they decided that the village of Menston would grow somewhat, and it needed a proper supply of water, because prior to that it was using wells and streams. Of course, a lot of the 19th century houses had cellars in with wells in them. Now, they built another pumping station just above Hillings Lane at the top of Moor Lane up there, identical to the one near High Roads Hall. And that pumped water into another new reservoir at the top of Moor Lane, which was virtually the same size as the High Roads reservoir. And that was pumping water, supplying it to the reservoir, which fed all the residents of Menston, both of them, for 100 years. So for 100 years between them, they were extracting 60 million gallons of water per year out of the ground. Okay? Now, in that time, a lot of houses were built around here. this was when this groundwater was being extracted. Then what happened, as you well know, the hospital was closed down, and given up to build 700 houses on it. So the pumping station was switched off, 2003-4, okay? Similar time or shortly after, the other one above Moor Lane was switched off, and Yorkshire Water decided to import all the water supply for the whole area from outside the area. Okay? So that's a similar amount of water. So not only after that point, which was about 12 years ago, was that groundwater not being extracted, we were getting hit by a double whammy. The same amount was being imported into the area and had to be disposed of in the area. Another 60 million gallons a year. A nasty double whammy. Now people may have noticed that the flooding has got a bit worse in that period, the last 12 years, in certain areas, and certainly the groundwaters has as well. So there's no doubt that that extraction did have an effect on the flooding around here. Right? Once it's stopped, it got worse. Whilst it was being extracted, there was no detriment to the moor itself, as far as I'm aware. There was no problem with supplying the water to all the reservoirs that are higher up, right, at all. So it didn't affect any of those, nor the vegetation, but did extract all that water locally. So you think, well, can we do that again? Well, for here, the two pumping stations, one's derelict, the other's been converted into a nice house at the top. Of the reservoirs, one's derelict, the other has been converted into a big 6-bedroom house, which now has a fantastic panoramic view of the whole of Menston, as you may have noticed. So I suggest you keep your bedroom windows, bedroom curtains closed. But they're not recoverable, okay? So, what about this water extract? Could we do it again? Pumping costs money, ongoing money, yeah, and you've still got to do something with the water. Unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be anybody who wants this water. Nobody wants to use it for anything. We just don't want it. So is there a way of doing something and replicating what went on for 100 years? Well, if I take the two extraction points, as I said, south of Highroyds Hall, Highroyds Hall, and above Moor Lane, then it's feasible you can do the following. Now, in the last 10 years, a certain technology has been perfected. And this is the technology of doing near horizontal drilling. It's easy to drill down, like to produce a borehole, which was done in 1880s, and take water out. What was not easy before was to horizontally drill in the ground. So what you can do is basically, if you took where the Highroyds extraction was, you can do a horizontal bore from where Meyer Beck is and get into the groundwater flow there. It's flowing down there at about 15-20 metres below ground level, and it would still have a slope on it going into Meyer Beck. So you can bore a hole, a horizontal hole, which is quite easy. You put a perforated pipe in right across the flow of the groundwater, and you can take it out and put it on an hourly, daily basis into Meyer Beck, which is actually what was done with Highroyds, because they got the water and they actually took both the sewage and the water, processed it and put it into Meyer Beck in the first place, right? But that's just repeating that. A similar thing could be done at the other one, where you can do exactly the same thing and feed it into a thing called Matthew Dyke. Right. So it will take groundwater. You're going across the flow of groundwater, remember, not down, across it, and as it flows it's going to go into this pipe and flow sidewards basically, but downhill a bit into an open stream. So you're doing that continuously. How much difference would that make? Well, obviously, if you did it as it was before, it would remove 60 million gallons of water per year from this small area. But to make it work properly, you really have to go all the way around the moor Ilkley Moor. You really do. Okay? Now, I would estimate the cost of doing one of these would be in the 10,000 to 20,000 pound category. The equipment exists, you can bore quite easily, very accurately in fact, and put pipes in. I'm not quite sure about the numbers, I'm guessing, but that's what it sounds like to me, that sort of number. So it would cost twice as much for Menston. If you were to do it round the entire Ilkley Moor, then you're talking about probably 100 such things in similar locations. There are locations when you look round of where there are streams and where you could take the groundwater flow out. So, if you did that, of course, if my costings are right, it'd cost £1 to £2 million to do that, the entire perimeter of the moor. Would it work? We have some evidence in Menston that it did work, right? That's the first thing. Now, what are we trying to do? The easiest thing to think about here is what's called the simple rain cycle, which you learnt in primary school. Okay? The rain cycle is simple. You've got the seas, oceans, water evaporates, forms clouds, the clouds move, and for us, they're basically forming near the Gulf of Mexico. They're going to clouds, the jet stream brings them over here. That takes 2 or 3 days. They come over land and they deposit rain on us. Okay? And rain gets into streams, which goes down into rivers, goes back into the sea, completes the cycle. Right? Now, just think a minute. If it didn't rain for 3 or 4 months, what would happen to the water flowing in the River Wharfe and the River Aire? It'd still be flowing. Not overflowing, but still flowing. Right? With no rain for 3 or 4 months. So where's the water come from? Well, what happens when the rain comes down, let's say on Ilkley Moor, some comes down off the surface, some comes just in the land, and that's water which is basically used to fill up the reservoirs. But more water goes deeper into the ground, and it takes a lot longer to flow in the ground than it does on the surface, and it flows, so you get different rates of flow of water at different levels in the ground, okay, going through. So any rain that fell from a given rainfall could be flowing in the river a few hours later, a few days later, a few weeks later, a few months later, a few years later, a few decades later, a few centuries later. The order of magnitude of the different flow rates is enormous. It's 12 orders of magnitude. Right? So you get this enormous range of how long the water is flowing in the ground. And normally, different depths, it takes longer. So there's a lot of difference between taking water out in the top, say 5 metres, as taking it out from 15 to 25 metres down, or even 50 metres down. There's a lot of difference in the age of the water, right, normally, okay? So what we're trying to do here is tinker with the rain cycle, okay? And by taking water out at some level, obviously we're stopping flows of water below that point in the ground, but you also create capacity above the ground as well with that flow. Now, let me just explain it in a totally different way. And these are the people who have a lot of plants in the house and water them frequently. Okay? So think of Ilkley Moor as a big plant pot. Okay? With plants in. And they're in peat, soil, rocks, everything, right? And the plant pots have holes in the bottom. Okay? We've got a big watering can of water. Okay? And first of all, give it the effect of flash flooding. I tip it on. Right? And of course it all comes over and floods. Okay? That's what happens with flash flooding. So now I'm a bit more careful. So I pour it, I go a tenth of the rate and pour it very slow, a lot slower, which is what these persistent, prolonged period of rain are like. So pour it, you know, it goes in, keeps going in, I keep pouring it. Then some starts coming out the bottom. Still keep pouring it, I still go in. Some more comes out the bottom. I can pour it all in, and then, you know, water still coming out the bottom and still comes out of the bottom for quite a while. I can do the same thing the following day. And that's essentially what we're doing here. And my estimate is for the 100 that I've just talked about round Ilkley Moor doing this, is equivalent to providing a capacity, an extra capacity in the moor for 100 millimetres of rain every year. So in other words, when you get these persistent periods of rain, right, you've created something like a real plant pot with holes in it, that you can put a lot more water in as long as you take your time, which these rainfall events do, and it'll drain through and be stored actually in the moor itself. The capacity in the moor to store water is absolutely enormous. Absolutely enormous. And that's what I'm proposing. It's very simple. It can be done very easily, and I'm pretty certain it will work. So let me just finish off, just reiterating certain things, and I'd like to go to another video. Right. Now, I want to show you, this was a video taken on the November the 15th. And those people in Ilkley, we know it flooded in Ilkley on November the 15th, right? And there was a lot of photographs showing the flooding on the playing fields, the rugby pitch, everywhere. The problem with most of the photographs, you couldn't work out how much water was involved. Looked very good for press and everything, but if you've got the right video, you can get a lot more information from it. Now, I'm just about to run a video, but before I start, you can see here that we've got the top of the wall, we've got the depth of the water. Okay? So if you took this photograph in dry conditions, we'd know exactly where the depth of the water was relative to the month. So that in each starting point gives us the depth of the water in the river, going across the river. By the way, underneath here is Dales Way Walk, going out next to the river, and it's a good job nobody was on it that day, because it's pretty deep there at this point. Okay, so I'm just going to run the video and just say something that goes on. Right. Now, watch as it pans across in a minute. Wait a minute, you can just see that. Now this is near to the tennis club. It says the wharf comes in now then, look at this, panning with the water as you go down. So from that, you can get the speed of the water. Right? Very easily. Right? So you got the depth of the water, you can get the cross section from knowing what the river is there, you got the speed of the water, so you know the volume of water per second that you're dealing with. So from something as simple as that, you don't need a big computer analysis or anything. You need a simple video clip. You can work out the instantaneous volume of water involved, And from the condition that I talked about, that I worked out, you can work out the total volume, or an underestimate of the total volume involved. So you get everything. So you know what you're doing. As compared to this, you might have seen that video on Boxing Day. No, it was the Sunday night, day after Boxing Day. It was on BBC, of Baildon Bridge, and showing the caravan going down the River Aire from Baildon Bridge. The thing about that was it followed the caravan, so you can get the speed of the river just from the caravan before it got completely destroyed on the metal footbridge. Right? Incidentally, you know, a bus was taken down there and deposited at Esholt, at the time, and also the people have been there. You see how it's destroyed all the dry stone walls, and that takes a lot of doing, right? It just shows you the forces that are involved here. They can be lethal. Okay? And let me go now on to the last slide. Right. This is from the Environment Agency. They started to produce this map last summer. Okay? Now, as you can see, I've deliberately chosen this area. Now, the lighter yellow type is the floodplains. The darker one is different. The darker ones are designated as minor aquifers where the ground has high permeability. That means the ground is capable of accepting groundwater. High permeability means if the conditions are right, it can flow reasonably quickly for groundwater in that environment. Okay? A lot of the areas it's not a real problem. The real problem starts when it's on a slope. And one of the problems about building nowadays is that you're starting to go the slopes at the side of the moors. And a lot of these are on slopes where you want to develop. You can see Menston, the old area. You can see Tranmere Park, etc. Part of Guiseley going into Yeadon, etc. But it's the sloping parts that cause the real problems. And this is where they talk about the groundwater table, and they think it's a flat table, and they talk about groundwater rising like that. That ain't what's happening here. Groundwater on that side I showed you with a 10-metre slope. The groundwater table slopes itself 10 metres. It's flowing water with a 10-metre slope. So when it comes out of the ground, it's already flowing and then flows on the surface. It's not just rising up, producing a pond. And everybody seems to think groundwater just rises up and produces a pond. It does not. On slopes, it's dangerous. On areas which are minor aquifers with high permeability, it's even more dangerous, particularly to start building on it without doing anything about understanding where the water can come from and what it can do. So I'll leave it there and leave it to questions. Okay.
I'm Andrew Fraser. I'm rather the outsider here. I live in Penrith in the Lake District. And,
you're right too.
But I'm hoping to move into Addingham or the Ilkley area.
Don't bring the rain with you.
No, I can show you it's pussycat stuff compared where I live in Penrith. And I'm a flood defence engineer with 40 years experience. And I admire and I agree with a lot what David's saying. Especially this assessment of the volumes and runoffs. And this is so important, and from my experience, it's vital that you capture and estimate these estimates, and it's what actually happens. And I still work part-time. I used to work for the Environment Agency, by the way, as well. So, and I now work for JBA, so I've got my foot in part-time. And I use a lot of my experience, and I am pragmatic, and I agree with what David's saying. A lot of good stuff there. I think you're underestimating the cost of doing this horizontal.
Well, maybe I am.
But
maybe
I think in relation to the benefits that you would attract, I think it's good. Yeah. And I can back in Penrith, I can almost give you an ideal, exactly the same situation with Persimmon Homes, where they've installing a SUDS scheme, on a slope, and it's the hydrogeology is complicated, and they've dug in, and they tried to install this scheme in between September and December last year, and you could imagine what I've been helping the local residents to do. So thanks very much for your talk.
Pleasure. Just to summarise, what I'm trying to say is that what's happened in the last few years is that we have got a lot of information on flooding from ordinary people taking photographs and video clips. No doubt about that, everywhere. I'm saying from an engineering viewpoint, mathematical viewpoint, from those clips, etc., you can work out a tremendous amount of information. What we also have in this country is a large database on rainfall in, is it 3,500 locations across the country? It's a lot. I don't know what they are. It's that sort of number, right? We have that, and it's pretty good. And in fact, in Menston, we're extremely privileged because there is our own weather station that does everything and measure the daily rainfall, the hourly rainfall, everything, the temperature, and the whole lot. The gentleman who runs it, is he here tonight? No? Okay. But if you go on the web and go on Menston Weather, you can bring it all up, you can get the historical records and everything. Right? So we're very fortunate. Okay? So that's what we've got. We can work out what's happening, the instantaneous flow from that. The big thing thereafter is working out volumes, and I say that's the thing where I've stolen from my own discipline, electronics. Right? And it's fascinating how it works. And probably I should say something about it, because as I said, you send a signal less than 1,000th of a second long from a base station to a mobile, and the problem is you can't model the channel. We talked about water going in the ground. Well, in this case you definitely cannot model the channel, because the signal you send hits buildings, gets reflected, hits the ground, gets reflected, goes through buildings. You may be travelling on a high-speed train. So the channel that it goes on is varying, it's continuously changing, but is it? And the key thing over that thousandths of a second, if you split it up the other way, frequency-wise, then you can say, and this is for the technical people, every 10 kilohertz of bandwidth, the information in it remains invariant. That's the thing that stays invariant. So what you do in the handset, it uses a semiconductor chip that splits it up into all those channels, the signal, a lot of them, normally 2,000 of them or more, instantaneously as far as you're concerned. And the signal that comes from the base station at the front end of it has a known piece of information, like ours measuring the peak of the rainfall. No? If you know that piece of information, you received rubbish, but you knew what it should have been. So you know how to transform your rubbish into what it should have been, and you do the same thing for all the rest of the signal and get a perfect signal. That's exactly what we do here. Okay? So that's how electronics applies to drainage and flooding.